All right. Thank you so much for having me. Um, I'm, well, it's great. Santiago is a great place, so it'd be fun to be there in person. But I'm glad to get a chance to share this work with you. So the paper I'm going to talk about today is called "Quantifying Racial Disparities Using Consecutive Employment Spells." This uses U.S. Census Bureau data, so standard disclaimers apply. Okay, so what's this? Oops. My Okay. So what's this paper about? So the broad motivation for this paper is that there are large black-white disparities in both unemployment and in earnings. Some of this is kind of clearly discrimination. If you look at audit studies, it lets you sort of reject the null of kind of equal treatment. A question that I think kind of remains open, though, is sort of how large are gaps in both unemployment and earnings among equally productive workers? So audit studies are great in that they let you reject the null of equal treatment. It's like basically audit studies tell you about differences in callback rates. It's very difficult to translate differences in callback rates into differences in employment and earnings. It takes a lot of assumptions. Generically, in terms of studying race, it's kind of very hard to generate natural experiments to study race. There's sort of the conceptual problem of like, what does it mean to be the Black Isaac Sorkin? And then in general, when you have sort of unobservables, when you have observational data, it's kind of hard to convince people that you've dealt with unobservables in a compelling way. So kind of the game of this paper is to give you kind of a new way of dealing with unobservables in observational data. So what's the idea? So the idea of the paper is pretty simple. The basic idea is that if you work at a firm for long enough, at some point, kind of the firm figures out stuff about you. And in particular, at sort of high enough tenure, if you were to ask the firm, like, give me two workers who are kind of equivalent in terms of productivity at this firm, who are they? You kind of think the firm could do that. At sort of high enough tenure, you kind of think the firm has learned the workers' unobservables. And so kind of this issue of how do you deal with sort of unobservables in observational data, well, kind of firm behavior gives you some way of getting some traction on this. This is all well and good, but kind of how do you know as the econometrician that you reached high enough tenure? What I'll argue is, and this will seem a bit obscure, but I think the intuition will become very clear once I show you some of the empirical results in the model, is I'll argue that kind of is that we've reached high enough tenure once kind of conditional group differences in separation rates have converged. The basic idea is sort of conditional on earnings. There are differences in separation rates between black and white workers. Then you can say, oh, look, that could be because of differences in unobservables. It's going to turn out that at high enough tenure, these gaps have closed. And the idea is that you kind of selected out the workers such the only workers who are left sort of have the same unobservables, and thus you have the same differences, thus you have the same levels of separation rates. But I'll show you this empirically, and I'll show you this in a model, and it will be clear. So this is nice, it lets you match workers, but how does this answer the question of interest? So the basic idea is we're going to take these firm match sets of black and white workers, and we're going to suppose that they sort of lose their job in a mass layoff. They're kind of tossed out into the labor market. And then we'll ask kind of how does the labor market treat these sort of seemingly equally productive workers? The basic idea is that the gaps that we see in earnings and separations are among equally productive workers. And then this will be sort of informative of sort of gaps in the labor market. This could be quantities among equally productive sort of black and white workers. So in order to make this sort of formalize this idea, I'll develop an equilibrium model of learning and turnover, which will help me sort of discuss kind of both the mechanisms underlying this and underlying any gaps I document, as well as sort of assumptions underlying this approach. This is not going to be an assumption-free exercise, as well as sort of how to label this gap.
Isaac,
Yep.
these unobservables are going to be like constant, or they're going to change over time?
So in the model I'm going to write down, it's going to be kind of constant. I'll sort of talk about why I'm guessing I can generalize this to sort of time varying unobservables. And I think it will be sort of like once I show you this sort of the basic empirical patterns, and then I show you the model, you'll sort of see why the model I suspect the model will generalize to take into account time varying unobservables. So I'll use US matched employer-employee data. What I'll first do is show you sort of a descriptive analysis of racial separation gaps among matched workers. So basically, I'll match workers on firm, quarter, gender, earnings, and tenure, and then I'll just sort of show you some interesting patterns of differences in separation gaps. What I'll show you empirically is that high enough tenure is about 8 years of tenure. So this is sort of conditional on observables. It takes about 8 years for sort of these conditional separation gaps to close between black and white workers. Then I'll look at these high tenured match sets of workers who separate in the same quarter from the same firm in a mass layoff. And the basic finding is going to be is that I'll look at these workers who separate from the same firm in the same quarter, and then I'll look at the earnings gaps in the next job. This is sort of in the next job, and I'll find the earnings gaps are about 5.3 log points. Is this large or small? Well, the unconditional earnings gap among high tenure workers is about 16 log points. This is about a third of the unconditional earnings gap among high tenure workers. So I view 5.3 log points as fairly large. About half of this 5.3 log point gap is between firm, which is mediated by the share of black workers at the firm, and I'll sort of be more precise what I mean by that. About half of that 5.3 occurs within firm. It's among workers who sort of, if they leave one firm and go to the same next firm, you still find a gap. But I'll explain more when I get there. In terms of separation gaps, sort of the separation gaps that you see in the first employment spell kind of reemerge in the second spell, which accounts for about 20% of the unconditional separation gaps. And I'll sort of do like a welfare calculation and argue this is about 0.6% of lifetime consumption. The black workers will be willing to pay about 0.6% of lifetime consumption to have the separation gap profile of white workers. Okay, the talk is going to have 5 parts. I'll sort of introduce the data, and I'll tell you sort of some stuff about how I handle the data. Then I'll tell you about sort of the separation gap, and I'll show you sort of some interesting heterogeneity, and I'll show you how this varies by tenure. And then I'll develop this model, and I think sort of when I show you the pattern by tenure, kind of the basic kind of intuitive idea that I have will be clear. And then I'll write down a model that will kind of make this intuitive idea more precise. And then we can sort of talk about all of the extensions you want me to do. And then I'll show you, in some sense, the main results of the paper could be in part 4, which is the outcomes in the second spell. And then the last part of the paper, I'll do this welfare calculation. But that will go sort of fairly quickly. So the goal is basically to get to part 4, and if we sort of end before we get to part 5, that's fine. Okay, part 1: data description, coding, and samples. So I'm going to be using matched employee data from the U.S. This is known as the LEHD, the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Dataset. It's built from unemployment insurance records. Basically, the unit observation is the amount of earnings in a firm worker quarter level. So you see how much I make from Stanford in quarter 1, how much I make from Stanford in quarter 2. And this is sort of useful for coding separations. You can use sort of overlapping earnings to do so. The data runs from 1993 to 2022. I'll use the data from 1993 to 2002 to code tenure. And then I'll start looking at outcomes in 2003, and then I'll end in 2019 to sort of avoid the pandemic. You get race and ethnicity from sort of merges that people at Census have done to the census and the American Community Survey. So throughout, I'll be focusing on the contrast between non-Hispanic black and white workers. I'll look at workers aged 18 to 61.
Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry, can I just clarification question? It's if I understood correctly, and given that you have these matched employee data, why you don't just go with something like AKM or Bonhomme-Lamont-Manresa and estimate these unobserved worker characteristics that could explain the wages, and then try to see if there are differences between blacks and whites, and see if these can actually correlate with differences in salary. I don't know if this makes sense or.
Yeah, so you could do that. My guess is what you'd find is that kind of black workers have kind of like lower person fixed effects. And then going to be kind of the question of how do I think about that? Do I think about that? Is that because there's lower human capital? Is that because of discrimination? And so then I'd just be sort of moving the ball. Like I agree that would be like an interesting descriptive exercise, but then in terms of kind of the question of interest, which is kind of like how important is something like discrimination, it wouldn't help me get there, because in some sense discrimination could operate through, like, sort of the person effect could reflect discrimination basically. So okay. So we have matched employee data. So in terms of coding separations, I'm going to think about, you'll separate from employer J. If you have earnings from employer J in quarter T, you have no earnings from employer J in quarter T+1 to T+4. So I'm trying to get rid of, so in terms of 4 quarters, so I'm trying to get rid of kind of recalls in seasonal employment. So kind of you're gone for a whole calendar year. But if you work with matched employee data, you kind of know that like workers exist workers with sort of complicated employment histories. So I'll focus on the workers with sort of I'll focus on the employment relationship from which the workers are earning the most money in that quarter, or the dominant relationship. And then I'll label a transition as employer to employer, EE, if they're overlapping earnings in a quarter, and it is EN, or employer to non-employment otherwise. Other data handling steps. So I'm only going to focus on full quarter employment relationships. So you're employed in T-1, T and T+1. Quarter T is also known as a sandwich quarter because it's sort of sandwiched between adjacent quarters. This is basically an attempt to kind of reduce variation in hours in explaining things. I'll also impose an earnings floor, again, an attempt to sort of minimize kind of variation in hours and things like this. Okay, so then I'm going to match black and white workers on both tenure and earnings. So the match sample is going to be black workers who have white coworkers in bins defined by the interaction of firm, year, quarter, gender, within firm, year, quarter, tenure, and earnings deciles, and then absolute sort of state, year, quarter, earnings, and tenure deciles. And then sort of other, so this is going to be the match sample, and then I'm basically going to reweight. So the distribution of white workers across these cells is the same as black workers. So if there's some cell where there are 5 black workers, or sorry, there's 1 black worker and 5 white workers, when I reweight, I'll give the white workers weight 1/5. Okay, so in terms of samples, I start with sort of something that kind of looks like big data, in that I have over 1 billion worker quarters. I have a bunch of workers, I have a bunch of firms. Here are some random statistics about them. In terms of black and white workers, what you can see is that I pick up, is that sort of between black and white workers, I have like over 85% of the labor market in terms of worker quarters. You can see that there are large unconditional earnings gaps between black and white workers, about 25 log points. You can see that sort of black workers in these sort of slightly more stable employment relationships are more likely to be female, they're slightly younger, lower tenure, etc. When I go to the match sample, the first thing to note is that I keep just over half of the black worker quarters. So I'm definitely not sort of picking up the universe once I go down to matching. What you can also see is that the earnings gap kind of shrinks and the earnings levels kind of rise. You can also see this is a more female sample, a higher tenure sample. When I reweight the white sample sort of across these cells in the match sample, it's sort of not surprising given that I'm reweighting, given that these cells are defined based on gender, tenure, and earnings, that I exactly match on gender, tenure, and earnings. Sort of the triumph of matching is that you also match on age, but we'll see lots of reasons to be, but I'm not going to place any stock in that I've like successfully matched on everything. This is not a selection on observables paper, but you can sort of see what things look like. So you might wonder sort of, I started with sort of 113 million worker quarters among the black workers, and I get down to 61 million worker quarters. You might wonder sort of, how does the match sample compare to the full labor market? So the most striking difference between the match sample and the full labor market is in terms of employer size. So what this figure is showing you, it's showing you the distribution of black workers across the employer size distribution just among all black workers, so the full sample. And then basically, so the top is the smallest firms, the bottom is the bottom row is the largest firms. So about 40% of black workers in the sample are employed at firms with 1,000 or more workers. Now, when I go to the match sample, you can see I basically lose sort of all of the small firms. There's sort of the sample, and then the sample is about 70% these largest firms. So this sort of makes, I mean, in some sense, this is unsurprising. I'm trying to find black workers who have coworkers who are in these narrow cells. It's much more likely to find sort of other people if there are more people to choose from. So this sort of makes sense. Kind of an interesting descriptive fact about the labor market, which is not novel to this paper, is that if you compare the full sample of white workers versus black workers are much more likely to be employed at large firms relative to white workers. White workers are much more likely to be employed at small firms. So I think kind of heuristically what people have in mind, sort of this is what people think explains this, is that kind of small firms are disproportionately kind of, basically it's like the owner is sort of hiring their friends who's founding firms in the US. It's disproportionately sort of white people. This sort of reflects sort of differences, sort of the racial wealth gap. Larger firms then sort of have more standardized HR practices. And so you sort of think that they're less, sort of they in some sense are hiring less through social networks. They have less sort of problematic hiring practices. So therefore, black workers sort of concentrate at large firms. And an interesting historical note is that sort of before the 1970s, this pattern was reversed. Black workers were more likely to be at smaller firms. Okay, so this tells you a little bit about the match sample versus the full sample. So now what I want to do is I want to get into analyzing this separation gap, and then showing you sort of how this varies by certain kind of firm characteristics, and then also how this varies by tenure, which will kind of motivate the rest of the paper. So what I'm showing you here is basically I'm showing you first the white separation, the white quarterly separation probability, and then the black-white gap. So to get to the black level, add together the black-white gap and the white level. In both the full sample and then a variety, and then in the match sample, and then kind of reweighting on a variety of characteristics. So the first thing to see is that the average white separation probability in a quarter is about 8%, and then the black-white gap is just over 2 percentage points. As we move to the match sample, you can see the match sample is sort of more prosperous. It's better than the full sample in the sense that the white separation gap is lower. And then as we reweight the white sample to sort of match the black sample in terms of the distribution across these cells, you can see that the white separation gap kind of rises. So basically, you're sort of placing weight on kind of less prosperous cells. And in some sense, kind of the most important jump is once we interact with firm, we get sort of this biggest jump in the white separation level. In terms of the black-white gap, you can see that sort of it declines when you move to the match sample, and it declines as you move sort of and as you reweight on a variety of things, such that in sort of the match sample weighted by the full set of covariates, black workers are about 6.6 percentage points per quarter are more likely to separate than white workers. Some of you might find 0.6 percentage points hard to interpret. An easier way to interpret this is basically to divide the black-white gap by the white level, which is what I do here. So in the full sample, the gap is about 40%. The black-white gap is about 40% of the white level. In the match sample, we're down to about 7% of the white level, which is still meaningful. Now, what you might wonder about is this is looking at all separations. You might think that kind of employer to non-employment separations are more problematic than employer to employer separations. So now let me sort of divide this right panel into employer to employer and employer to non-employment separations. So this is what it looks like for EE separations, where sort of the black-white gap is still sort of 5% of the white level. If you look at E&E separations, it's about 9% of the white level. So basically, there's a bigger gap in ENE separations than there are in EN separations than there are in EE separations, but there's still a gap in EE separations. Okay.
Sorry.
Yep.
So in terms of so your information on the worker is basically gender, age, and tenure. You don't have earnings. So you don't have information on education.
So yeah, so I have. So we'll see education later on. Basically, I have there's an education variable which is not imputed for about 10% of the sample. So I'll use that. I'll show you later on that this matching it kind of works well, and that you're sort of balanced on education as well. But I don't want to use that as sort of in the primary analysis because I lose so much of the sample.
Okay.
And you'll so in the first part of the paper, I kind of have infinite sample. In the second part of the paper, I don't have a ton of sample, so I don't want to do things to cut my sample.
But in terms of because if I understand correctly, you're going to argue there's some evidence of discrimination, right? So when you're comparing like the full, like in this example here, when you're comparing sort of the full sample,
yeah,
some of this is going to be driven by the fact that the black workers have less education on average, right?
Exactly.
That's why. But when you go to this sort of match test, typically the black worker will have more education, right? There's discrimination.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so we'll come back to this when we get to the model. We'll come back to this of like, should we think about matching on earnings in some sense? We're like potentially over controlling. And so yeah, so completely. Yeah. So we'll come back to this. Yeah, agreed. Okay. So now I want to show you two kind of interesting descriptive sort of breakdowns of this black-white separation gap. So the first one is to split the sample by the share of black workers. So this is showing you the white level as the share of black workers at the firm varies. So this varies from sort of there are basically no black workers at the firm to in the bottom row, it's sort of a majority black firm. And then on the left panel, and then on sort of to the left, what we're seeing is sort of the black-white gap as we sort of look across these groups. And sort of the striking thing is that once we get to sort of is that basically as we increase the share of black workers at the firm, the black-white gap kind of declines and in fact goes negative at firms that are kind of majority black. Sort of this is in sort of the fully. So this is so what I'm going to show you now and going forward is I'm sort of matching on everything. So this is sort of matching on earnings, tenure, gender, etc. And so in some contexts, people sort of think that kind of same race interactions are sort of less subject to bias than kind of cross-race interactions. So what you might take from this is that sort of some or a lot or all of the black-white separation gaps that we see, sort of conditional on observables, you might think are kind of about bias. But I'm not going to push that interpretation too hard because there are reasons to think that sort of same race interactions might not be sort of free of bias. The other interesting descriptive thing is to sort of split this by sector. And what you see is that kind of retail trade has sort of the largest gap. And then public administration and education actually have the smallest gaps, and these are negative. And what's sort of striking about kind of both sort of retail, it's sort of about retail trade and things like hotels and restaurants, and other things that sort of have kind of high levels of where these separation gaps are large, is these are sectors that in sort of audit studies sort of typically come out as sort of more discriminatory. And also there's sort of more customer interaction, and you might think that this might drive some things. Anyway, so this is just sort of, okay. So this slide is just kind of like fun, descriptive stuff. You don't need to remember it for what's going to come next, but I think it's kind of interesting. Okay, this next slide you do need to remember for what's going to come next. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bin the sample by these absolute state year quarter tenure deciles. So there are 10 bins. So there's kind of variation in tenure within each of these bins, but what I'm plotting here is sort of the mean level of tenure in each of these bins. So the first thing that you can see is sort of the standard thing you would expect from like every paper about separations in the labor market, which is that the white probability of separating kind of decline. The white has been separating kind of declines in tenure, and then by the time you get sort of past 5 years, it kind of flattens out, and it's sort of pretty low. The thing you might not have known is that the black-white separation gap kind of sort of displays a somewhat similar pattern where it starts out positive, kind of declines in tenure. And if you look very closely at these lines, what you can see is that actually at high enough levels of tenure, these dots are actually lie below the 0 line. So to make this easier to see, I'm going to divide the black-white gap by the white level. And this is what this looks like. And then I've also split this by EN versus EE separations. And what you can see is that sort of the black-white gaps, the share of the white level kind of declines in tenure. And then after about here, after about 8 years of tenure, the EN separation, the EN separation gap actually goes negative. Like whether you want to lean on this too strongly as being negative or just basically a 0, given the low level, I leave that up to you a little bit. But this figure is basically where the rest of the paper comes from. So the idea is, at low levels of tenure, we can explain kind of separation gaps between black and white workers is there being kind of differences in unobservables that sort of the employer is selecting on. And then basically, once we get to like high enough tenure, the firm has sort of selected out the workers based on unobservables, such that sort of the surviving black and white workers are kind of similar, or have a similar distribution of unobservables. And then the idea is, so I'll sort of write down a model that makes this idea precise. But then the idea is let's take workers who separate here, who kind of we think have sort of survived this trial by fire and have gotten to this high level of tenure and are kind of similar at this employer, and then let's see what happens to them at their next employer. So that's sort of, so I'm basically going to write down a model that's going to make that idea precise. Right. Are there any questions at this point?
Yes, I do have a question. So for someone who is not familiar with the type of tools and the type of analysis you're doing, what in the analysis can rule out the possibility that two workers, one black, one white, earn the same, but basically the black one is trapped in that situation, is more productive than the white, but is trapped there for some reason, while the white basically has outside options that the black doesn't have, including going to work with his friends entrepreneurs when they have the need, and that explains the quality in the wages and not actually that observables.
Yes. So let's come back to this. So I think the general. So I guess there's a slide that kind of discusses this in a little bit. The basic flavor of things is going to be that. So one interpretation of what you've said is that sort of white workers have better outside options than black workers. Therefore, kind of for the same level of productivity, the white worker should make more. Therefore, if I'm matching black and white workers on earnings, if anything, the black worker is better. Therefore, what I'm going to show you should sort of look like a lower bound. So that's kind of one flavor argument. I think there's a embedded in what you said. There's a different argument, which is so I think that I'm fine with like what I'm going to show you is sort of fine with that. The more problematic version of what you've said is, in some sense, like suppose that like because the black workers sort of don't have like as good outside options, they're then more willing to make investments in firm-specific human capital. So then, in some sense, like their earnings, like their sort of productive ability is less portable than the white workers. So then, sort of depending on your model of wage setting, you might get that kind of black workers make the same amount as white workers, but it reflects in some sense like worse outside options for black workers. So that's kind of like that's sort of more problematic for what I'm going to show you. I'll argue later on, and so this is sort of a version of like the black workers human capital is less portable than white workers human capital. I'll argue later on that sort of when you look at sort of some of the subgroup heterogeneity, it's like a little bit hard to, this doesn't really scream out kind of differences in the portability of human capital. But we can sort of, but you can sort of judge for yourself, and so we'll kind of come back to that. We'll kind of come back to that.
Okay, so related to this about interpretation, so the argument of the paper is so the moral of the paper is what is hit a number and say that is the right number to look at, or look, I'm going to show you that there is some discrimination and that is somehow controversial.
So
what is the bottom line message?
So the bottom line message is I'm going to give you a number, and I'm going to argue that from most sensible things, it's probably a lower bound. And so this number is sort of relative to, well, this is a number that like some papers sort of pick. Like if you look at like the Shea, Hurst, Klenow, Shea, Hurst, Klenow, Jones, Shea paper, they kind of get a number in this ballpark, but this is sort of like maybe discrimination is like a third of the gap. But this is sort of, I think, like a more compelling way of sort of identifying that number. It relies on sort of it's clear where that's coming from, I guess.
So I'm asking this because if we have to interpret the number as a lower bound,
yeah,
I want to know how much power has the lower bound related to the hypothesis or the question. You know, if so many people say, you know, there is no such a thing as discrimination, you show us a lower bound that is sizable. Okay, that tells us a lot.
Yeah.
If the question is, we all know that it is discrimination, we just don't know how much, and you're going to show us a number that is relatively low, and that is a lower bound, that may not be super informative. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. So I think you should interpret this as people think there probably exists some discrimination. I think it's sort of hard to say how much. I think this is a lower bound that you should interpret as sizable. And so in that sense, it should shift your views. I think sort of secondarily, I think this is sort of showing there's sort of like there's kind of a portable idea here about how to measure kind of discrimination in the labor market. So like a new research design that is sort of portable to other circumstances and other potentially other gaps where you might think that discrimination matters. And so there's sort of, so independent of whether you're interested in the black-white gap in the US, you might think that this could be useful in telling you about like migrant native earnings in other setting in many other countries, or things like a portable way of studying this other gaps as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let me get into the model. So the model is going to be super simple. The goal of the model is just to sort of show you the simplest setting where this works. I've sort of half worked out a variety of extensions, so we can sort of talk about kind of your favorite modifications as we go on. Okay, so this is going to be sort of, so as I said, this is going to be like the world's simplest model to illustrate this idea, rather than the most complicated model to illustrate this idea. So there are going to be two groups given by C and D. Worker types can be high or low. They're going to be persistent and permanent, but we can sort of talk about sort of what evolving worker types would do. Then the group share of the high type might differ between the groups. This is given by this alpha G. So there's going to be sort of some standard search model stuff. So the flow value of unemployment is going to be B. Unemployed workers are going to receive an offer with probability lambda. The outside option of the firm is going to be pinned to this V equals 0, which is kind of an implication of allowing for free entry. The model is going to generate kind of endogenous and stochastic separations in the following way. The output of the match is going to be the worker type plus an idiosyncratic shock epsilon, which is known before production, and it's IID each period. So basically, the flavor of the model is going to be that if we know is it in some sense the high type, like the way the model is going to work is going to be there's more surplus in a relationship with a high type worker than with a low type worker. What that means is that these high type worker relationships will be more resilient to shocks than relationships with low type workers, and so you'll get sort of higher separation rates with low type workers. That's sort of going to be the basic idea. Final piece of the model, to keep sort of life simple, workers are going to live for 2 employment spells. The terminal payoff is going to be the market's view of their type. And this won't matter very much for reasons that I'll explain in a second. Okay, so the information structure is one of asymmetric learning, where the first employer after one period is going to know the worker's type because they see the shock distinct from the output. So after one period, they can tell you who are the high type workers, who are the low type workers. But then it's going to take the market or the second employer a while to figure out who are the high type workers, who are the low type workers, because they're not going to see the shock distinct from the output. Instead, what they'll see is they'll see kind of tenure, and it sort of they'll basically see tenure, and they'll basically try to invert tenure to learn the worker's type. And then they'll potentially also use earnings, but I'm about to make earnings uninteresting. So just in terms of sort of thinking about like the time it takes for the firm to figure stuff out, there's how long it takes the firm to figure stuff out, and then there's how long it takes the market to be able to sort of to infer the worker's information set. And so there are these two types of learning. So wage setting could potentially be very complicated. The wage of worker of type G, tenure T, where the firm probability of there being a high type, it could be some arbitrary function. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to have firms make take it or leave it offers. What this is going to mean is that the firm gets all the surplus. It's going to address issues of bargaining with asymmetric information. This might seem unattractive, but let me sort of try to convince you that this is sort of a sensible way of just sort of getting some basic qualitative intuition. So basically, like all I really need for this kind of result, for this model to work, is that sort of the history of wages do not fully reveal the firm's information set. So if there remains information in tenure, sort of conditional on earnings, then everything I'm going to say is basically going to go through, but it's just going to be a lot more complicated because you have to worry about like the signal, like, you know, when wages move, the market's going to infer something about that. So you have to take into account like how the market sort of how the worker values the market's update about their type and etc. So this is sort of a super extreme thing where wages convey no information. So basically anything where wages convey some but not all information is gonna the basic idea is gonna work. So kind of the empirical defense of living in this world is that if wages were to convey all of the firm's information, then it would be hard to generate kind of conditional separation gaps. The conditional separation gaps that we saw where at low levels of tenure, Black workers are more likely to separate than white workers. It'd be hard to do that if sort of wages conveyed all the firm's information, because then there'd be no like unobservable explanation for these differences in separation, sort of differences in separation rates. So I think this is sort of a semi-reasonable assumption. If it would be nice to be a little more formal about why this makes sense. Okay, so now what you get out of this model, sort of skipping over a bunch of Bellmans that I think are kind of uninteresting, you basically get out the separation rate for high type workers is lower than the separation rate for low type workers. So then you can write the separation rate for workers of group G and tenure T is given by this somewhat horrible expression, which amounts to weighting the group specific the group shares of initially of high and low types over time. So if you stare at this expression for long enough, you can get out a few things. So if, for example, the share of high types among group C is higher than for group D, then the C separation rate will be lower than the D separation rate. Because 1 minus SL goes to 0 faster than 1 minus SH raised to a power, as tenure grows, basically the group separation rates kind of converge to just the high type separation rate. And even if you sort of start with group differences in the distribution of unobservables, at high enough tenure, you sort of converge on there being no separation gaps. And the basic reason is that all that's left are sort of the high type workers. You've sort of dynamically selected out the low type workers, and the only thing that's left are the high type workers. So this is where this kind of formalizes the idea that I kind of started with, that kind of high enough tenure basically means that kind of group separation rates converge, in which case kind of these workers should be sort of the same in terms of their unobservables. So this next slide is sort of showing you basically the flip side of this. It's basically just restating what I just showed you on the previous slide, which is that the market's belief that workers are high type given T periods of tenure in the first spell in group G is given by this expression, The only important thing about this expression is that as tenure goes, is tenure sort of goes to infinity, the probability of the worker is a high type goes to 1. So thus, sort of for high enough tenure, we can sort of think about workers as being matched on unobservables. So that then in a second spell, kind of outcomes shouldn't depend on group identity, because sort of any gaps in earnings or separations are sort of among kind of equally productive workers. Okay, so that's sort of what I wanted to get out of that. That's like the model that kind of shows you the basic idea of the paper. We can now talk about sort of what are the kind of key assumptions embedded in the model. So there's sort of 2 key assumptions embedded in the model. The first is that there's sort of no second unobservable, which is basically what the first employer learns is kind of relevant to the second employer. If the first employer is learning about your ability as a basketball player, what's relevant to the second employer is your ability as an economist, you might think that sort of what the first employer learns sort of doesn't really matter. And so kind of when you match on your ability as a basketball player, you haven't matched on your ability as an economist. The second assumption, which we've talked about, is one of sort of equal treatment, that kind of the first firm is kind of only engaged in rational employer learning. They're not separately engaged. They're not separately sort of engaged in sort of biased behavior towards Black or white workers. So what happens if these assumptions sort of fail? So if the first assumption fails, then in some sense, sort of the whole conceptual idea of the paper sort of falls apart. The premise of the paper is that sort of the first employer is going to match up the workers based on their productivity at that firm, and being equally productive at that firm should sort of tell us about productivity at other firms. To the extent that's not true, then what I want to attribute to sort of bias, you might just say is just about kind of this kind of second dimension of unobservables. So given that I'm kind of telling you about this paper, I think that this isn't a plausible explanation for the data. And what I'll kind of argue is that sort of some of the heterogeneity mediation analysis that I'll show you is kind of hard to reconcile with sort of simple sort of second unobservable stories. Go ahead.
So like match specific productivity would be like what you're calling second unobservable?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of, but I'll sort of show you stuff that I think doesn't really look, anyway, we will sort of see stuff that I think doesn't really look like that, but we can sort of talk, you can kind of, at least it seems compelling to me, it may or may not be compelling to you. In terms of the second assumption, this generates sort of either an upper or a lower bound. So if the employer acts biased against Black workers, potentially because of, say, differences in outside options between Black and white workers, then this is going to be a lower bound, because by matching on earnings, I'm sort of over controlling. Whereas if the firm is sort of biased against white workers, then this is going to look like an upper bound. I think sort of what we saw in terms of sort of some of the first spell earnings gaps, sort of splitting by share Black, what we know from audit studies kind of makes me think that we're kind of in lower bound world, but you might have a different prior. Okay. So now I want to show you these outcomes in the second spell. Let me pause and see if there are any other questions. All right. Let me power through to the second spell. So the spirit of this is that these sort of workers have kind of survived. They've gotten to high tenure at the first employer, and then they're going to lose their jobs in a mass layoff, and then we'll sort of see what happens to them.
So, sorry, going back to sort of Ernesto's earlier comment.
Yeah.
So you're gonna assume like basically the probability of being reemployed is gonna be the same. Like finding a new job is not gonna depend on the type, right? The lambda.
So I'll show you differences in sort of time spent unemployed, which are gonna turn out to be so if you were to sort of extend this model and allow for like differences in lambda and give like workers like lower lambdas, this would be sort of a form of kind of like Black workers have worse outside options, and then that would generate kind of something like kind of Black workers have then sort of by matching on earnings, I'm kind of over controlling if you think that the outside options show up in earnings determination.
Yeah, so I guess I haven't seen the results, but so I guess in a sense it depends on sort of what you label discrimination. Because when things to say, well, I'm gonna hire workers on being black, I'm not gonna pay them less because they're black, or they find worse jobs because they have worse networks, and that's a form of discrimination. But those
Yeah.
are sort of two different forms of discrimination, right?
Yeah. So exactly. So yeah. So I agree with this. So I think that anyway. So yeah. So I'll come back to this. I completely agree that you might not want to. That I think I am comfortable saying that what I'll document are like different. So the language of equally productive is kind of carefully chosen, which is I feel comfortable saying that these are gaps that look to be among equally productive workers. Whether you want to attribute this to discrimination by particular actors is a little more complicated, and I'll come back to this when I sort of go through some of the heterogeneity mediation analysis, because I'm sympathetic to the discrimination language is like too strong and raises hackles, and there's reasons to not like it. There are also reasons to like it in the sense that, like in the Aigner and Kane paper, they define discrimination as like differences in earnings among equally productive workers. But I think but anyway. So but I'll exactly come back to this. I think I think we're on the same page. Okay. So let me show you some data you've seen before, some data you haven't seen. So this top panel you've seen before, which is just reminding you of statistics among all workers, like among all black and white workers. So this is this 25 log point gap we saw before. What the second panel is showing you is high tenure workers. So what you can see is there's a 16 log point gap. And what you can see is that about 28% of black workers are ever high tenure, whereas about 40% of white workers are ever high tenure. Then what I'm going to show you is high tenured matched and reweighted separators. So what you can see here is that these matched and reweighted separators have earnings that sort of lie between the mean earnings kind of lie between the earnings among high tenure black and white workers. So these workers sort of don't look kind of wildly strange. So I'm going to sort of ultimately what I'm going to do is I'll sort of extrapolate from sort of these samples to this sample, and based on this, they don't look wildly different. So they have about the same amount of tenure, and then this is in terms of sort of share female and age. They look kind of like high tenure workers. So this is sort of these are all of the separators. Then these are the mass layoff separators. So basically I started with like a lot of data. When I go down to high tenured matched and reweighted separators who lose their job in a mass layoff, I'm down to sort of a fairly small amount of data. And so in the first part of the paper, you didn't really see standard errors. Going forward, you'll see some standard errors. And yeah. All right. And then there's sort of so basically when I'm down in this part, I was so in the first part of the paper, I was just matching on 1/4 of earnings. It's part of the paper I'm matching on 2/4 of earnings, because this sort of this kind of kills the mean reversion. And then in terms of sort of what high tenure means, it's the top 3 deciles of the state year quarter distribution, and there are 20 or more quarters of tenure, just to sort of cut off some of the weird sort of low tenure ones. What you can see is the mean level of tenure is over 11 years in this sample. Okay. So in general, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present sort of results of regressions that sort of look like this, which is I'll have some outcome for worker I at horizon K. There'll be an intercept, and then there'll be an interaction with black, with whether or not the worker is black. So K is going to be the horizon relative to separation. So negative will be before the separation. Positive will be sort of after finding the first post-separation job. So the post period, so what I'm going to only show you is what happens in the first post-separation job. And this is based, and I'll explain why in a second. And then I'll look in the match sample, sort of reweighted at each horizon, sort of conditional on the mass layoff from the same firm in the same quarter. So what I'm going to show you is going to look like kind of a traditional displaced worker paper, but it's going to differ from a displaced worker paper in 4 ways, which I sort of want to kind of emphasize just so you kind of know what you're looking at. So the first way is there's no control group of non-displaced workers. I'm just going to be looking at kind of the black-white comparison, kind of with sort of these workers who lose their job from the same firm in the same quarter in a mass layoff. The second difference is typically people do this sort of generalized diff and diff, and they run one regression to sort of and then they just report the results of one big regression with lots of leads and lags. I'm going to be running separate regressions at each horizon. This just sort of makes it easier to keep track of like what comparisons I'm making at each horizon. So basically, so particularly what's going to happen is in the second job, kind of like over time, black workers and white workers are going to leave the second job. And so there's going to be attrition as we go out in the second job. And so basically sort of the set of people I'll be looking at will change as we go out. But I'll be kind of reweighting to sort of to keep track of who's there, rather than sort of relying on kind of like the fixed effects to do it, which is a little, we've learned recently two-way fixed effects sort of weights the data oddly. So I wanted to stay away from doing that kind of thing. The third thing is I'm going to be looking at post-separation earnings only at the first job with a sandwich quarter post-separation. So typically in displaced worker papers, you just sort of look at all earnings kind of sort of following the job loss. Here, I sort of want to look only at the first post-separation job because that's in some sense where the black and white workers sort of have the same history. And so the labor market should be able to sort of infer the same thing about them. Whereas if they've sort of gotten one job, they lose it, they get another job, then sort of the differences can sort of reflect these sort of differences in labor market history that are harder to interpret. The final thing is that rather than sort of plotting things in kind of event time, kind of relative to the displacement, I'll just show you timing relative to getting the first post-separation job, and then separately I'll show you any base differences in time to the first post-separation job. Okay. So earlier, so before I show you that, I want to show you this stuff about education. So earlier there was the question of is there education in the data, and are we balanced on education? So this is showing you kind of the 4 education categories that I have, and looking at kind of the non-imputed, the sample of people with non-imputed earnings. And what you can see is that there's sort of approximate balance on education. It's sort of the black-white gaps, all of them just barely, the confidence intervals overlap, sort of overlap 0. And so it sort of looks like kind of among these high tenure mass layoff separators, kind of that we're approximately balanced on education. So there are 2 reasons that you should appreciate this result. The first reason is this is sort of a test of the research design in the sense of I'm kind of matching on a bunch of stuff, and then this is sort of something I'm not matching on, and I'm showing you, look, this held out variable, we kind of get balance, the triumph of matching. The second reason you should sort of like this is that conceptually, the thought experiment is that in some sense, kind of like your earnings and tenure should sort of jointly kind of summarize everything about you. Like the labor market should sort of be pricing stuff in, and the tenure should sort of be taking everything into account. And so basically, like if you've spent 10 years at a firm, like who cares like whether or not you went to college? Like, you know, you are who you are. The labor market shouldn't really care about where you went to college. But there are reasons that you might think that sort of kind of college remains a salient signal of ability even beyond your sort of earnings history and your employment history. And so the fact that it shows balance on this is sort of kind of raises, sort of helps mitigate one concern you might have about looking kind of going sort of about a source of gap between black and white workers kind of going forward. Okay, so I'm going to declare triumph here and move on.
Sorry. So, but this, does this say that the sort of the initial job, like in the initial job, workers sort of are getting paid by the productivity and not like there's no discrimination in the initial job? No? They have the same
That's
education.
right. Yeah,
Same
no, that's right.
earnings.
Yeah, exactly. No, I like that. Yes. I think so another way of saying it is that this is a triumph of matching in the sense that it's also showing you that kind of in some crude sense they have, I like that interpretation. I'll take it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and sort of, yeah, exactly. Like a kind of a Haka blinder would say, oh, look, in this sample, we don't find discrimination. So yeah, if you want to interpret the Haka blinder. Okay. So I'm going to show you this sort of event study graph. of sort of the black-white earnings gaps among the high tenured matched mass layoff separators. So this is showing you in the 2 quarters sort of before they separate, and I match them based on these 2 quarters. So it's kind of mechanical that they're very small black-white earnings gaps. The thing that's sort of more reassuring is here's sort of the earnings for the 15 previous quarters. You can see that things aren't necessarily quite as pretty as you might like, but there are 2 things you should take away from this. One is the gaps sort of hover around 0. 2, there aren't any sort of trends in the gaps, and it's sort of fairly stable. So because ultimately I'll want sort of a lower dimensional summary of my parameter estimates. What I'll do is I'll kind of draw this line, which is sort of the average across these dots, weighted by the number of black workers, except in this case, they're the same number of black workers in all the dots. Then what we're going to do is we're going to see what happens to these workers who are these very small earnings gaps before their separation. We're going to ask what happens when they lose their jobs and then they find their next job. What are their earnings in their next job? So this is sort of the time path of earnings in the next job, where each of these dots represents sort of a separate regression, and then I'm weighting by the number, and then the solid line is weighting by the number of black workers. And here on the right-hand side, there are kind of fewer and fewer workers as we go out because workers sort of leave their first post-separation job. And so just to give you one number, the gap between sort of the difference in difference is about sort of 5.3 log points. So the comparison I've sort of mentioned before is that the unconditional earnings gap among high tenure workers is 16 log points. So this is kind of large. So what are sort of various mediating outcomes? So one thing that's come up is maybe there's sort of differences in the time it takes black and white workers to find jobs. So you can see that on average, it takes white workers about 2 quarters. Then black workers take about 16% of a quarter longer to find a job, which translates to about 2 weeks. So you can see that there is a difference here. It's sort of pretty noisy. It's not huge. You might wonder about other differences between these firms. You might wonder, okay, so that's sort of like how long it takes to find a job. You might then wonder about, do they end up at different kinds of firms? So the first one is asking whether they find a job in the same sector as the firm from which they've lost their job. So almost half of white workers find a job in the same sector, and black workers are just over 1 percentage point less likely to find a job in the same sector. You can see as with sort of the time gap, it's there, but it's kind of noisy and kind of quantitatively small. Another characteristic you might wonder about is mean firm earnings. So again, black workers end up at firms that pay less. This is so 2.3 log points. Given the overall gap is 5.3 log points, this is sort of meaningful. I'll show you in a second that it works out to be smaller than you might think. But again, this is pretty noisy. The one that kind of really screams out of the data is that white workers end up at firms that are about 14% black. Black workers end up at firms that are about 21% black. So about 50% greater share of the workers, the firms that black workers end up at are black. So this is a very large difference. So what I'm going to do now is, rather than just looking at these numbers and trying to interpret them directly, I'm going to ask what happens to the earnings gaps in the second spell if I control for these characteristics, where the idea is not that, like, I think that these are like exogenous, but this is just asking like how much of the earnings losses are sort of mediated by these characteristics. And so the interpretation is going to be like anything kind of correlated with these characteristics is going to be sort of the explanation. So right, so I'm going to run kind of the same analysis I did before, where in the pre-period, of course, there are no differences. So the pre-period is exactly what we saw before.
Sorry, may I so could you go back 1 second, please? Mean firm earning is a proxy of size.
Oh, sorry. This is the the average earnings, the average worker earnings at the firm.
Given the discussion that we had before about outside option, do you have also the characteristics of size of the firm?
So I do not. Yeah, I should have done size of the firm. I have not done size of the firm. So my guess, based on what we saw before about the employment distribution of Black workers across the firm size distribution, is that Black workers are going to end up at larger. Is that what I would guess from this is that Black workers are ending up at larger firms than white workers. But this is just a guess based on that early figure and then this. But I don't actually know for sure. Right. Whereas in some sense, like the mean firm earnings would make you think the other way, because in some sense there's a firm size gradient. And so the fact that Black workers end up at lower paying firms would make you end up at smaller firms. So it's sort of like an interesting, sorry, I should have said this when I showed you the fact that Black workers are more likely to be employed at large firms. Is sort of like unconditionally, if I were to tell you there's a group that's more likely to be employed at large firms than another group, which group do you think has a lower separation rate? We would say probably the group that's employed at the large firms, because large firms are more stable. So it kind of works out. So despite that, it kind of things sort of go the opposite direction of what you'd expect. So, which is to say that I have a supposition based on these results, but like I think some of the results don't line up with your priors because there's sort of interesting, like among large firms there's heterogeneity among. So anyway, so I should look into that. But yeah. Okay.
You see what I'm asking, right? It's because of the discussion about outside options and all of that. So this will give you a nice way to tell whether that story has some quantitative bite or not.
Well, so I think that the share Black is going to be helpful. So I think the share Black is actually going to be very helpful in thinking about this as well, for reasons you'll see in a second. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, so on the right-hand side, what I'm doing is I'm additionally controlling for same sector, and so basically I'm asking kind of like how much of how much the Black-white gap is sort of, it can be explained by the fact that Black workers are less likely to get a job in the same sector. So what you can see is that the gap shrinks from 5.3 log points to 4.9 log points. That explains about 6% of the gap. So it's there, but it's kind of quantitatively very small. So that kind of confirms the basic thing that sort of same sector kind of matters, but it's quantitatively small. If I then look at mean firm earnings, the gap shrinks to about 4.6 log points. That's about 13% of the gap. So kind of, and in some sense, what's interesting is that's smaller than what we saw for so the gap in mean firm earnings is about 2.3 log points. We only shrunk about 0.07 log points, sort of 0.7 log points of this. So, so it's saying that kind of they're like match effects that play out differently by race to sort of rationalize the data. Finally, the one that really has bite is sort of controlling for kind of the share Black at the firm, which is the gap shrinks to about 2.4 log points from 5.3 log points. So this says that you can explain about 55% of the earnings gap because Black workers sort of are more likely to go to firms go to firms that have higher share of Black workers. So what I'm going to do on the next slide is I'm going to kind of interpret this result, and in this I think touches on a variety of questions a variety of discussions we've already had in this seminar. So kind of what does the share of Black workers proxy for? So one possibility, and which is sort of what you'd get out of like a Becker model, is that it proxies for sort of the amount of discrimination in hiring. Kind of firms that have more Black workers are less discriminatory in hiring. And so this is exactly telling you about kind of the importance of sort of discrimination in hiring in sort of generating these gaps. Kind of the Black workers end up with sort of these, they end up in these worse firms because of discrimination. Alternatively, it could just be that kind of share of Black workers is sort of proxying for social networks. And they're sort of, they're like race-specific social networks, and this sort of shows up in terms of job finding. Now, sort of in terms of language, I think that, is this sort of the amount of discrimination in hiring, or is this social networks? It kind of affects your policy conclusions. And then if you think it's discrimination, then, sort of anti-discrimination legislation could do something. If it's social networks, that's like much harder to affect via policy. But if you were to ask yourself, like, do I feel better about the world because the gap is driven by differences in social networks, or the gap is driven by the amount of discrimination in hiring, I'm not sure that you feel better about the world if I tell you it's sort of the non-discriminatory explanation. So I think this is the sense in which, like, I want to be careful about using the sort of the discrimination language, but I don't think that even if you can't use the discrimination language, I don't think this sort of gets rid of your kind of your normative concern about these outcomes. So what I think I've kind of maybe showed you is that kind of half of the gap can be explained by between firm sorting, which is mediated by the share of Black workers at the firm. So the question is, what's the other half? Is there other between firm sorting that isn't mediated by share of Black workers at the firm, or is this sort of within firm? So I'm going to go down to so to answer this question, I'm going to go down to a kind of weird subgroup, which is the subgroup of workers who they both lose their jobs at firm A, and then in a mass layoff, and then they both go to firm B in the same quarter. So you're sort of conditioning both on the outcome of the search process and the time of the search process. And then, so the sort of interesting data fact is about a quarter of the Black workers, this is true for about a quarter of the Black workers, so this is kind of a weird corner of the data, but it does let you sort of ask kind of what happens if, Black and white workers start at the same firm making the same amount and they go to the same next firm, or are they treated the same? And this is what this looks like. As you sort of can guess from the small sample.
Sorry, that's like a lot of people, like a large number of the guys who are separated go to the same. Am I reading this right? Like a quarter of the guys who got separated go to, like, the sample's very similar. No? It's like, so this is like not a rare event. It's like
Exactly. Yeah. So it's sort of, so what I think is sort of like one thing. Yeah. So I don't have I think I need to do a little more. So I've convinced myself that this is not like, what you might worry is this is just like administrative, like coding errors,
like merger acquisitions.
Yeah, so if I go back here, I've like done work to try to convince myself that I'm like ruling that out by basically saying that if like 20% of workers from A go to B, or 20% of workers at B come from A, and I do that in this sort of quarter by quarter. If this is, then I sort of don't count this as a separation. So I'm ruling out kind of large flows between these firms. But it could be very small. So it could be like, you're buying like, a small chunk of the firm, and I'm not throwing that out. But in general, these are kind of, it's like 5 or 10 workers are making this switch. And remember, the firms that are initially, these firms are large that I'm looking at. So there are like hundreds of workers who are losing their jobs. And if you kind of think that like, you're maybe ending up, so these look like kind of, and these workers who are moving sort of look like kind of, they look like sort of they're slightly positively selected. And if you look at the white level, so anyway, so basically like these workers aren't experiencing earnings losses. They're kind of getting good outcomes. So my guess is they're going to like large, high paying employers. And so it's like, these are kind of the lucky people is the way I sort of think about this. So I think it's kind of like an interesting data fact, but I think it's not spurious, but anyway. But I agree, it's like a little odd. And I've kind of worried about this and tried to convince myself it's not spurious, but I'm sure there's more things I can do to convince other people that it's not spurious. So you can see that this is sort of, that everything is a lot noisier because the samples are small, and you might not love some of the time path. Like you might not like that it's like positive initially and then drops down a lot. but I'm going to like summarize the data in the same way I've been summarizing it so far, which is the gap is about 2.6 log points. And so if you remember, we started out with a 5.3 log point gap. When you control for sort of like the share of black, you get down to a 2.4 log point gap. And then when you're within the same firm, it's like 2.6 log points. So loosely, if you want to kind of extrapolate across these samples, you can kind of say half of this is this sort of between firm mediated by share of black, half of this is kind of within firm. So again, this within firm stuff, you could apply the label of discrimination to it. You could say, look, like, these workers with the same history, they should be paid the same amount. It's discrimination. It could also just be that it reflects differences in outside options, kind of potentially reflecting differences in networks. I think the same point about affecting policy, like it affects your policy conclusions. Do you feel good about the world if it's not the discrimination explanation? I'm not sure. And so to sort of sum up, which I guess I've done before, there's this 5.3 log point gap about closes 2.4 log points controlling the share of black workers. This is the half is between firm mediated by share of black workers, and then half is within firm. So to come back to what we sort of started with about the second unobservable. So the reason that I think that the second unobservable, this sort of match specific thing is less plausible is first we've shown that kind of this same sector stuff is very small. So kind of same sector is kind of one observable form of a second unobservable in the sense that if you think of sort of sector specific human capital, the fact there aren't differences in sector switch or very small differences in sector switching suggests that this sort of observable form of second unobservable is likely to be small. I think kind of the share of black workers kind of labels the between firm gap, which feels a lot more about either kind of like networks or discrimination than it does about productivity or something. So it sort of, it's not obvious that you would label this as like a productivity relevant unobservable as being mediated, as being described by the share of black workers at the firm. And then when you go down to kind of the sort of they're going from the same firms, it's then kind of like the same technology. So again, it kind of seems, it seems less plausible that this is sort of telling you about, like, they had, like, the black workers had better match quality at the first firm at the second firm, given it's kind of the same two firms. It'd be a little weird for that to be different between the black and white workers. This is what I can kind of say about kind of why I don't think it's the second unobservable. So why I do think that these gaps, you should think about them as being between kind of equally productive workers. So in terms of, so I started the paper by saying we care about gaps in earnings and employment. I've spent less time talking about employment so far, but this is where I'm going to tell you about sort of separation gaps. So this is showing you gaps, the separation gap in the first spell, which is this 0.6 percentage points per quarter. Black workers more likely to separate. And this is what it looks like sort of in this second spell. Black workers are almost 1 percentage point more likely to separate than white workers. Again, this is kind of noisy. One way of thinking about this is relative to the unconditional gap we saw in the first spell. This is about a third of the unconditional gap. You might feel that separation gaps in terms of employment to non-employment transitions are more problematic than all separations. This is showing you the same graph for sort of the EN separations. So you can see that sort of the second spell gap is slightly smaller than the first spell gap, but relative to the unconditional gap is about 20% of the unconditional gap. So that's sort of the number that I gave you in the intro. So the point is there are kind of these meaningful separation gaps, so a meaningful share of the unconditional gap kind of reappear in the second spell. I could either stop here or I could spend 5 minutes talking about the welfare calculation.
I think we have time.
Okay, I'll go through this quickly. Okay, so basically what I want to do is these separation gaps. Like when I tell you, oh, there's a separation gap of like 0.3 percentage points per quarter, that's like it's a little bit hard to understand. So what I want to do is I want to basically say, like, suppose you're black and white workers who are facing the labor market. The only thing that differs the only thing that differs in your labor market experience is the probability of separating is this like 0.3 percentage point difference in separations. Like how much would black workers be willing to pay to not have that additional probability of separation? So that's kind of the exercise. So the model is basically like workers are born unemployed, there's a flow path unemployment. a job with probability lambda, all jobs pay W, workers live for A periods. There's no borrowing or saving, people are hand to mouth, so period utility is CRRA with coefficient gamma. And the group difference is just the probability the job is destroyed depends on group membership and tenure. So then kind of the value functions are sort of standard. An employed worker gets a flow payoff. They can lose their job or keep their job. An unemployed worker gets a flow payoff. They can find a job or remain unemployed. And then the next period, you're aging. So A goes from A to A+1. And then the key thing here is that workers are kind of born unemployed. So you basically, given sort of, when you pick parameters, you can sort of solve these things through. And then you can solve for the value of being age 0 of different groups. And then you can solve for the level of the constant consumption that black and white workers experience that sort of delivers this value. And then you can kind of compare the constant level of consumption for black workers and white workers that kind of reflects the differences in the deltas, basically. So I'll pick sort of what I think of as sort of fairly standard sort of parameters to get some sense of this. And then this is showing you a bunch of numbers. So this top row is showing you, suppose I'm taking the difference in EN separations. You get a difference in unemployment of about half a percentage point, which is about 10% of the unconditional unemployment gap over the whole sample period. The present discounted value of consumption is different by about 0.3 percentage points. Black workers will be willing to pay about 0.6% of lifetime consumption to have the separation profile of white workers. If you instead use all separations, so the EE separations as well, these numbers get a lot larger. If you make the state of unemployment more valuable, the baseline was 0.4, then workers are willing to pay a lot less. This sort of makes sense, given basically, if black workers are more likely to be unemployed, if you make that state more valuable, they're willing to pay less. The flip side of this is that sort of elements of the safety net are more valuable to black workers than to white workers. This is giving workers the job finding rate of white workers, and you get sort of numbers don't move very much, and then making workers more risk averse, you get larger numbers. Okay, so to wrap up, sort of the motivation for this paper is sort of some black-white disparities in unemployment and earnings, or probably discrimination. It's kind of hard to kind of get to quantify this. Sort of audit studies don't tell it, or it's hard to get to quantities because it tells about differences in callback rates. It's hard to deal with unobservables. So the idea of this paper is that sort of at high enough tenure, firms have learned about worker unobservables, and then I'll sort of suppose that workers lose their job from the same firm in the same quarter, and ask what happens to the next job. The idea is that the gaps you see are among kind of equally productive workers. The basic finding is that there's sort of meaningful gaps, about a third of the unconditional gaps, about half of this is between firm, about half of this is within firm. And then there's sort of meaningful separation gaps that sort of emerge that you sort of see among these matched workers as well. And that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Isaac, for the presentation. I don't know if anybody has any more comments or questions. I have a. So do we expect this sort of the second spell gap to sort of disappear over time? I'm thinking about your first spell, which you saw like high tenure workers that have similar education, similar earnings.
Yeah.
Do you expect sort of these things to sort of disappear over time?
So I sort of had the prior that I expected this to be true, but if you look at the dynamics, like if you look at that, so I mean, so if you look at the dynamics for the A to B ones, I mean, it's very noisy, it's sort of hard to say.
Yeah.
If you look at the dynamics here, it's like maybe the gaps are converging, maybe they're not. So it's so I think that so given that in this one you're sort of conditioning on survival, you would sort of think that you should converge for exactly the same reasons you sort of expect convergence in the first job. Yeah. It doesn't. I mean, perhaps it's like I haven't gone far enough out to see it, And you can, you can squint at this and kind of see this upward trend if you want, or you can see, well, you can sort of draw different lines. So I'm sympathetic to that. Yeah, I think that is sort of a basic implication of the flavor of thought of model I've written down. I'm not sure it doesn't scream out of the data to the extent that I had expected it to.
Thanks. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, thanks, Isaac.
Yep. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
So sorry
Sure.
about that. So
Go.
is there anyone else? Okay. So going back to the question about the big picture,
Yeah.
you said that there are two takeaways from this paper. One is about the number, interpreted as a lower bound,
Yeah.
and the second is a methodological improvement.
Yeah.
At least in the presentation, of course, I don't know about the paper, but in the presentation, I don't see enough. I mean, I do see a lot of information about how you get to the number, but not so much about what to take out of that number or comparison with competing methods to tell us that this method can solve some issue better than others. I mean, thinking about a general audience. So probably this is trivial for insiders, but
Yeah.
for outsiders,
Yeah.
we at least I feel that we need a little bit more information to really value the number and value the methodology more broadly.
Yeah, so I think, yes, I mean, I guess sort of, yeah, so this is, yeah, so maybe, yeah, you're not the only person to complain about this. I think sort of the, yeah, I mean, I think sort of the flavor of, like, these first 2 points about, like, hard to get to quantities from audit studies, hard to deal with unobservables and observational data, is a gentle way of saying, like, there's no number in the literature that you should really believe. So here is a way of getting to a number that maybe you should believe. But that's aggressive.
I mean, it's a fine claim as long as you provide information to support it. So, for instance, if there's some placebo exercises that tell us, oh, there's really something going on with the black and white and not among whites or whatever.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So there's stuff I've done that I haven't disclosed where like. Yeah. So there's one stuff I've done which is like you can look at like the white Hispanic gap, for example. And what's kind of interesting is that when you condition, even once you just condition on like match on observables, like the gaps kind of go away. And so there's something sort of very specific about the black-white gaps, and something I intend to do. So I'm that's like something I might show. Something else I think would be kind of interesting would be to like look among white workers and to look at like differences in education, and then say suppose you take like high tenure white workers who have different levels of education but earn the same amount. Then look at the next firm. Like my guess is you probably don't see meaningful gaps. Anyway, so sort of kind of things flavors along this line of like what the first employer is doing is sort of kind of matching workers up, and for other groups this you don't see gaps emerge, and then for this group you do, and I think that would also help address some of your skepticism.
For instance, in the first 2 bullet points, you say, this is hard to get, hard to deal.
Yeah.
So another way to ask the same question is it possible to implement some competing methodology to quantify that implicitly you're criticizing here?
Yeah.
And tell, this methodology is going to fall because of this in this data set. I control for that, and this is the true number.
Yeah, so I think sort of like the leading other things is sort of playing games of like taking observational data and generating kind of increasingly rich sets of controls. And so it's a little hard to do that in this data set, but if you like take census data and like control for like education or something, you get down to like a 10 log point like education and industry and other things, you can get down to like a 10 log point earnings gap. Yeah, I mean, so I'm sympathetic to, so I'm sympathetic to wanting like comparisons to other things. I guess I've just always viewed, even like when I teach this stuff, I always just viewed these papers of like, take observational data and try to measure discrimination as like sort of like a hopelessly flawed exercise. So I like don't really want to get into sort of, you know, like it just feels like, you know, because you could endlessly debate like, are you like, is this control? Am I over controlling for something? Is this, you know, predetermined? Blah blah. And like these are like intellectually interesting debates, but like I don't think they like conclude. They just, you know, you just endlessly have them. So I'm a little nervous about sort of taking a stance, like sort of even presenting something as like, oh look, like here's a prototypical analysis along these lines, because I just sort of find them hard to get into in some sense. But I'm sympathetic to wanting more kind of like context and more explanation and more. And I think the next version of the paper will probably have more of that. So.
Great. Anybody else? So thanks again, Isaac. Thanks everybody to attend.
Awesome.
See you next week. Next
Yep.
time. Well,
next time. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you.